Bumpy Johnson had been at Alcatraz ever since his transfer from Atlanta back in 1954. During that year-and-a-half period, he'd built up what the prison administrators described as excessive influence with the other prisoners. This wasn't achieved through violence or threats of force. Bumpy was 50 years old by 1955, far too seasoned and intelligent to depend on physical strength. Instead, he wielded intelligence. He understood the inner workings of the prison system and guided fellow inmates through navigating those same systems. He became the person others sought out when problems arose, problems that the guards either couldn't handle or simply refused to address. This type of informal authority frightened prison administrators far more than violent prisoners ever could. Violent inmates were manageable. You could control them using isolation and physical force. But prisoners who earned respect through intelligence and organizational skills, they were a different matter entirely. These individuals created alternative power structures inside the prison that competed directly with official authority. They reduced other inmates' dependence on guards while increasing their reliance on one another. They challenged the core assumption of incarceration that the institution possessed absolute, unchallenged power over those it confined. Associate Warden Miller had been observing Bumpy for months now. He'd noticed certain patterns. He'd seen the subtle ways other inmates deferred to him, how disputes got settled without any guard involvement whatsoever, how information traveled through networks that seemed to have Bumpy positioned right at their center, even though he never seemed to be actively coordinating anything. Miller wanted to break this dynamic. He wanted to prove that no inmate, regardless of how intelligent or well-respected, existed beyond the reach of institutional control. The method he selected was solitary confinement in what both inmates and guards called the hole. These were the isolation cells located in D Block, reserved for serious disciplinary violations. Men confined there spent 23 hours each day alone in the dark, with almost no human interaction and even less mental stimulation. 30 days in the hole shattered most men. It transformed them, made them desperate for any kind of human contact, made them willing to submit to whatever authority demanded just to escape the crushing weight of isolation and the absence of sensory input. Miller assumed it would have the same effect on Bumpy Johnson. He was mistaken. When the guards arrived at Bumpy's cell that November morning to inform him of his punishment, they anticipated resistance. They expected protests or displays of anger, or, at minimum, some visible reaction that would justify using force to transport him. Most inmates fought against solitary confinement orders. They created scenes. They had to be physically restrained and carried to the hole while screaming about the injustice and making threats of retaliation. Bumpy simply looked at the guards and posed a single question. Am I allowed to bring books? The senior guard, a man named Patterson who'd been working at Alcatraz for 6 years and had overseen dozens of hole placements, found himself surprised by the question. What books? Am I permitted to have reading material while in solitary? Patterson conferred with the other guards. The regulations weren't entirely clear on this matter. Technically speaking, inmates in disciplinary segregation weren't supposed to possess personal property. However, some wardens permitted books based on the theory that reading was preferable to allowing prisoners' minds to completely deteriorate during extended isolation periods. Alcatraz's specific policy varied depending on who happened to be making the decisions at the time. I'll check with the associate warden, Patterson told him. Bumpy gave a nod. I would appreciate that. The tone was courteous, respectful, not submissive, but not confrontational either. Simply a reasonable request delivered in a reasonable manner. This troubled Patterson more than anger would have. Anger was normal. Anger could be managed. This calm acceptance suggested that Bumpy had been anticipating this moment, that he'd prepared himself for it, that he viewed it as an opportunity instead of a punishment. An hour later, after Miller had been consulted and had discussed the situation with the warden, Patterson came back with an answer. Bumpy could have books, but only poetry. The reasoning was that poetry volumes were compact. They couldn't be fashioned into weapons. and they wouldn't provide the kind of sustained narrative engagement that might help inmates maintain psychological stability throughout isolation. Poetry was fragmented, challenging, often intentionally obscure. Miller believed it would prove more frustrating than beneficial. What Miller failed to understand was that poetry was precisely what Bumpy wanted: dense language that rewarded reading multiple times, verses that could be committed to memory and recited during the endless dark hours, rhythms that could give structure to time and thought. Poetry wasn't a restriction. It was ideal. Bumpy requested his first book, The Collected Poems of William Wordsworth. They escorted him to D Block. No resistance whatsoever. No dramatic displays. Just a 50-year-old man in prison clothing, carrying a thick volume of poetry, following 4 guards through corridors while other inmates observed from behind their bars. Everyone grasped what this signified. Bumpy Johnson was heading to the hole for 30 days. He'd either emerge broken or he'd emerge stronger. There wasn't much territory in between those two outcomes. The hole at Alcatraz consisted of 6 cells in D Block. Each one measured roughly 9 feet by 5 feet, solid steel doors. No windows, no furniture besides a thin mattress resting on a concrete shelf. A toilet and sink. Nothing more. The doors featured small slots through which food trays could be passed, and tiny openings that permitted minimal air circulation but almost no light whatsoever. When the lights in the outside corridor were switched on, which only happened during meal delivery and periodic inspections, a thin sliver of illumination might seep through these openings, but the majority of the time, the hole was exactly what its name implied: darkness so complete that men lost their sense of time, couldn't see their own hands held directly in front of their faces, began experiencing hallucinations within days due to sensory deprivation. Bumpy was assigned to cell number 14D, the furthest from the corridor entrance, which meant even less light and less sound compared to the other isolation cells. Miller's instructions had been explicit: give Johnson minimal contact. Feed him the required meals, but don't engage him in conversation. Let him experience the full weight of isolation. The door shut, the lock engaged, and Bumpy Johnson stood in darkness, holding a book he had no ability to read. Most men at this particular moment would have felt panic rising. The abrupt transition from the prison's standard environment, where despite being confined you could still see light, hear sounds, interact with other human beings, to this absolute isolation, created a kind of psychological shock. The darkness felt like it was pressing inward. The silence took on a physical quality. Your own breathing became the loudest sound in existence. Some men began screaming within the first few hours. Others retreated into themselves, becoming nearly catatonic. Bumpy sat down on the concrete shelf serving as his bed and started examining his environment with the methodical attention he'd developed over 30 years of surviving in dangerous places. First, the door. He moved his hands along the steel surface, located the food slot, approximately 12 inches wide, 6 inches tall, positioned at roughly waist height, felt the edges, understood the mechanism. When this slot opened for meal delivery, light would enter. Not abundant light, but some. Second, the air openings. Tiny holes positioned near the top of the door, perhaps an inch in diameter each. When corridor lights were illuminated, the smallest amount of light would leak through these as well, not sufficient for seeing under normal circumstances. But Bumpy wasn't planning on operating under normal circumstances. Third, the gap beneath the door. Standard prison construction left approximately half an inch between the door's bottom edge and the concrete floor. This existed for drainage and air circulation purposes, but it also represented another potential light source. When the corridor was lit up, the thinnest strip of light would appear there. Bumpy started making calculations. If he could maximize every conceivable source of light, if he could position himself with perfect precision, if he could train his eyes to adapt to minimal illumination, he might be able to read, not comfortably, not for long stretches, but enough. The first night, he made no attempt to read, just sat in darkness, allowing his eyes to adjust, thinking through the problem. His body's internal clock told him when it was likely nighttime, when the corridor lights would be turned off and absolutely no light penetrated his cell. During those hours, he focused on other activities, physical exercises performed in the dark, mental exercises, reciting things he'd memorized years earlier, working through mathematical problems in his head, reconstructing memories in precise detail. The first meal arrived at what his internal clock suggested was early morning. Breakfast, based on the timing, probably around 6 a.m. Bumpy heard footsteps echoing in the corridor. Then the corridor lights came on. He could detect the faintest glow seeping through the air openings and beneath the door. Then the food slot opened, and light flooded in. Not bright sunlight, just fluorescent corridor lighting. But after hours in complete darkness, it was blinding. Bumpy squinted, allowed his eyes to adjust, and looked at the guard's silhouette visible on the other side of the slot. The guard, someone Bumpy didn't recognize, pushed a tray through. "Breakfast." "Thank you," Bumpy said, accepting the tray. The slot remained open for perhaps 30 seconds while the guard waited to collect the previous meal's empty tray, which didn't exist yet since this was the first meal. Then the slot closed. The corridor lights stayed on for another minute or so while the guard moved to the other cells. Then darkness returned. Total light exposure, maybe 2 minutes. But during those 2 minutes, Bumpy had learned several important things. First, the light coming through the food slot was adequate for reading. Not comfortable, but adequate. Second, the corridor lights remained illuminated for a brief period following each meal delivery, which meant light leaked through the air, openings, and under the door even after the food slot closed. Third, he'd need to develop a strategy for maximizing these brief daily periods of light exposure. He ate his breakfast slowly in the darkness, thinking about the Wordsworth collection he possessed. The book contained hundreds of poems, short lyrics, longer narrative pieces, fragments, and complete works spanning Wordsworth's entire career. If he could read even a handful of poems during each meal period, he could work through the entire volume within a week or so. But he'd need to be strategic about it. Reading in minimal light strained the eyes. He'd have to position himself with precision, hold the book at exactly the right angle, and make the absolute most of every second of available illumination. When lunch arrived 6 hours later, by Bumpy's estimation, though time in the hole was slippery and unreliable, he was prepared. The instant the corridor lights came on and he saw that first glow beneath the door, he positioned himself at the food slot with his book. When the slot opened, he was already holding the Wordsworth collection up to the opening. The pages angled to capture maximum light. "Lunch," the guard said, pushing the tray through. Bumpy accepted the tray with one hand, set it to the side, and immediately opened the book to where he'd marked his place, started reading. The guard stood there for a moment, clearly confused by this behavior. Most inmates grabbed their food desperately. This one was ignoring it to read poetry. "You going to eat?" the guard asked. "In a moment," Bumpy replied, not lifting his eyes from the page. His eyes moved rapidly across the lines of Tintern Abbey, Wordsworth's meditation on memory and nature and the passage of time. The perfect poem for solitary confinement. Perfect themes for a man locked in darkness, contemplating his own mental state. The guard shrugged and closed the slot, but the corridor lights remained on for another minute while he completed his rounds. Bumpy immediately shifted his position, got down on his hands and knees at the base of the door where the half-inch gap allowed light to leak through, lay flat on the concrete floor, held the book in that thin strip of illumination, and continued reading. The light was barely sufficient. He had to hold the book inches from his face, had to tilt it at precise angles to catch the glow. But it worked. Line by line, he progressed through Wordsworth's verse. "For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity." The corridor lights went off. Darkness returned. But Bumpy had read perhaps 2 pages. Maybe 60 or 70 lines of poetry. Not much by conventional standards, but in the whole, it was a victory. He sat up, ate his lunch in the darkness, and spent the next hours before dinner mentally reviewing what he'd read, reciting the lines he'd memorized, thinking about Wordsworth's themes, how nature provided consolation, how memory preserved experience, how time changed perception but couldn't destroy the essence of meaningful moments. The poems took on different dimensions when read under these conditions. Wordsworth wrote about solitude as though it were a gift, a space for contemplation and growth. And here was Bumpy in enforced solitude, testing whether that romantic notion held true when solitude wasn't chosen but imposed. By the end of the first day, using the 3 meal periods and the brief windows of light they provided, Bumpy had read perhaps 8 or 10 pages of poetry, maybe 200 lines total. He'd memorized perhaps 20 of the best lines, the ones with the strongest rhythm, the most memorable images. It wasn't rapid reading, but it was reading, and it was structure, and structure was survival. By day 3, Bumpy had refined his system. He discovered that if he positioned his book at the food slot the instant the corridor lights came on, before the slot even opened, he could begin reading immediately and maximize his time. He'd learned that lying flat at the base of the door provided him an extra 60 seconds or so of reading time after the food slot closed. He'd figured out which poems in the Wordsworth collection were short enough to finish in one light session and which required multiple sessions across different meals. The guards noticed this unusual behavior. Patterson, making his rounds on day 3, observed Bumpy through the food slot and saw him lying on the floor, book pressed against the gap under the door, reading in light that barely qualified as illumination. "What the hell are you doing, Johnson?" Bumpy looked up from his book. "Reading, sir. Wordsworth. Would you like me to recite some? The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers." Patterson shook his head and moved on. What was he supposed to do? Bumpy wasn't breaking any rules. He'd been granted permission to have books. How he chose to read them wasn't specified in the regulations. If the man wanted to strain his eyes reading poetry in near darkness, that was his choice. But Patterson reported it to Miller anyway. Johnson's reading, like obsessively reading, uses every second of light during meal times, lies on the floor to catch light under the door, acts like those poetry books are the most important thing in the world. Miller wasn't initially concerned. Reading poetry in minimal light for a few minutes daily wouldn't prevent the psychological breakdown that 30 days of isolation typically produced. If anything, the frustration of attempting to read in inadequate light might intensify the isolation. Let him strain his eyes, let him lie on cold concrete, it was still punishment. But by day 5, something unexpected was occurring. The guards delivering meals reported that Bumpy would recite poetry at them. Not crazy babbling, structured recitation. He'd quote Wordsworth back through the food slot. Complete verses memorized perfectly, delivered in that calm, measured voice that suggested his mind wasn't deteriorating whatsoever. "I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills," Bumpy would say when the food slot opened. Then he'd take his meal, thank the guard politely, and return to reading in whatever light remained. This was unsettling. Most inmates in the hole were barely coherent by day 5. They'd be begging for release, crying, making deals, promising to behave. Bumpy Johnson was reciting romantic poetry and asking if the prison library had any Shelley. By day 7, Bumpy had finished the Wordsworth collection. He'd read every poem in the volume, some multiple times, some only once, but all of them absorbed and considered and memorized to varying degrees. He requested his next book through the meal slot. "Do you have Byron or Keats? Any of the romantics?" The guard, delivering lunch, a younger man named Morrison, who'd only been at Alcatraz 8 months, didn't know what romantics meant, but he wrote down the request and passed it to the library. The next morning, breakfast arrived with a new book, Selected Poems of Lord Byron. Bumpy took it with the reverence most men would reserve for sacred texts. Byron, the poet of rebellion and passion and defiance. Perfect reading for a man locked in the hole for challenging institutional authority. He started with Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Byron's long narrative poem about a disillusioned aristocrat wandering through Europe seeking meaning. The themes of isolation and alienation and the search for purpose resonated in ways Byron probably never intended. Reading about Childe Harold's voluntary exile while experiencing involuntary imprisonment created strange parallels. But Bumpy focused particularly on Byron's shorter lyrics, the poems with strong rhythm and memorable language. She walks in beauty with its perfect meter, when we two parted with its themes of betrayal and loss. Darkness, with its apocalyptic vision of a world without light, which felt almost too relevant given his current circumstances. The reading process remained identical. Position himself at the food slot when corridor lights came on, read during the brief window when the slot was open, then shift to the floor gap for additional minutes of reading after the slot closed. Eat meals in darkness while mentally reviewing what he'd read. Spend the long hours between meals reciting verses, working through meaning, connecting different poems to each other and to his own experience. By day 10, he'd worked through Byron and had requested Shelley. The guards delivering his meals noticed he'd started speaking in meter. Not constantly, just occasionally. My gratitude for sustenance this day, instead of thanks for the food. Small linguistic choices that suggested his brain was restructuring itself around poetic language. This bothered some guards, made them uncomfortable, like Bumpy was performing subtle mockery, speaking in elevated language to highlight the contrast between his intellectual pursuits and their role as jailers. But they couldn't point to anything specifically wrong with it. Being polite wasn't a violation. Speaking poetically wasn't against regulations. Around day 12, Associate Warden Miller conducted a personal inspection, accompanied the guard delivering lunch to cell 14D. Watched through the food slot as Bumpy positioned himself to read in the brief available light. "You're reading a lot," Miller observed. Bumpy looked up from his book. "Shelley now. Ozymandias and Ode to the West Wind." "Yes, sir. Poetry mostly, since that's what's available. Currently working through Shelley." Fascinating how he uses natural imagery to discuss political and social themes, very relevant to questions of power and authority. Miller felt irritation rising. This was supposed to be punishment. This inmate was discussing literary criticism. "You understand you're being punished, correct? This is disciplinary segregation." "I understand, sir, and I'm serving my time. The books help make the time productive. I'm grateful they're allowed." That word, grateful, somehow made it worse. Bumpy wasn't broken, wasn't begging for release, was grateful for the opportunity to read poetry in near total darkness for 30 days. "How are you reading in here?" Miller asked. "There's no light." "I've found ways, sir. The food slot provides light when it's open. The gap under the door lets through enough illumination to read when the corridor lights are on. It's not ideal, but it works. I'm probably reading about an hour total per day. Maybe a bit more. Enough to get through a book every 2 or 3 days if I focus." Miller did quick mental math. If Bumpy was finishing books every few days, that meant he'd read 4 or 5 volumes already in less than 2 weeks, while locked in near total darkness, using scraps of light that were never intended to be sufficient for reading. "You're going to ruin your eyes," Miller said, which was stupid the moment the words left his mouth, because why would he care about an inmate's eyesight? Bumpy smiled slightly. "Possibly, sir, but I'd rather ruin my eyes reading great poetry than preserve them staring at darkness. Seems like a worthwhile trade." Miller left without further comment. Made a note in his report. "Inmate Johnson has developed methods for reading despite minimal light in segregation cell. Appears to be using isolation period for self-education. Recommend continued observation." But Miller was beginning to understand that the punishment wasn't working as intended. Bumpy wasn't being broken, was instead using the isolation as an opportunity that most men would never have. Weeks of uninterrupted time to read and think and memorize great literature. By day 15, Bumpy had worked through Shelley and Keats and had requested Tennyson. The guards delivering meals had started leaving the corridor lights on, slightly longer than regulations required. An extra 30 seconds here or there, not out of kindness exactly. But out of a strange respect for what Bumpy was accomplishing, watching a man read poetry in conditions that seemed designed to prevent reading created an odd kind of admiration, even among guards who were supposed to be enforcing punishment. Bumpy was reading The Charge of the Light Brigade when he noticed the extra light time, didn't comment on it, just used the additional seconds to read a few more lines. The poem's themes of obedience and duty and sacrifice in the face of obvious futility felt relevant. Theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. He wondered if the guards saw themselves in those lines, following orders even when the orders seemed pointless. Probably not. Most people didn't analyze poetry that way, but Bumpy couldn't help it anymore. Everything connected to everything else. The isolation had stripped away distractions and forced his mind into patterns of deep reading and analysis that he'd never had time for on the outside or in general population. He moved through Tennyson's longer poems, In Memoriam with its meditation on grief and faith, Ulysses with its aging hero seeking one final adventure. The rhythm of Victorian poetry was different from the Romantics, more controlled, more formal, more concerned with social propriety even when discussing deep emotions. But the technical skill was impressive. Tennyson had mastered meter in ways that made complex ideas sound simple. By day 18, he'd finished Tennyson and requested Whitman. Leaves of Grass arrived with his breakfast the next morning, American poetry now instead of British, free verse instead of formal meter. Whitman's sprawling, undisciplined celebrations of democracy and individualism, and the body felt like a radical departure from the structured verses of Wordsworth and Byron. Reading Whitman in solitary confinement created interesting contradictions. Whitman wrote about connection to other people, to nature, to the democratic mass of humanity. And here was Bumpy, more isolated than perhaps any other moment in his life, reading celebrations of connection. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Did those lines mean anything when you were locked in darkness with no human contact beyond guards pushing food through a slot? Bumpy thought they might mean more, not less. The absence of connection made Whitman's poetry more powerful, created longing for the world of light and contact and shared experience that the poems described. By day 20, the guards were openly discussing how strange the situation had become. Bumpy Johnson had been in the hole for nearly 3 weeks, longer than most men could psychologically handle, and he was reading American poetry and reciting Whitman during meal deliveries. I am large, I contain multitudes, Bumpy said one morning when the food slot opened, quoting Song of Myself at the surprised guard who was just trying to deliver breakfast. The guard, Patterson, who'd been present for Bumpy's initial confinement, just shook his head. You're something else, Johnson. Thank you, sir. Whitman believed in the multiplicity of self, that we contain contradictions. Seems appropriate for prison, where men are one thing on the outside and another thing on the inside. Patterson didn't respond to the literary analysis, just delivered the food and moved on, but he reported to Miller that Bumpy was still reading, still mentally sharp, still showing no signs of the psychological breakdown that should have occurred by now. Miller was beginning to feel something he rarely experienced, doubt about whether the punishment system actually worked on certain types of inmates. Bumpy Johnson had now spent 3 weeks in conditions designed to break the strongest men, and he was discussing Walt Whitman's theories of selfhood. Around day 23, Bumpy requested Emily Dickinson. I've been reading mostly male poets, he said through the food slot. Would be good to read a woman's perspective. The library sent him a collected edition of Dickinson's poems. Bumpy started working through them with the same focused attention he'd given the others. Dickinson's compressed, cryptic verses were harder to read in poor light. The dashes and unusual punctuation required close attention, but the themes resonated. Dickinson wrote about death and immortality and the interior life, wrote as someone who'd spent much of her life in voluntary isolation. Her poems felt like they'd been written specifically for someone in solitary confinement. I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Bumpy recited to himself in the darkness. In prison, everyone was nobody. Your name didn't matter. Your reputation didn't matter. You were just a number, a body to be contained and controlled. But Dickinson suggested that being nobody was actually a kind of freedom. That public identity was a burden that nobodies didn't have to carry. By day 25, he'd worked through most of the major Romantic and Victorian poets, had read Whitman and Dickinson, and was requesting whatever else the library had. They sent him T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, modernist poets whose fragmented, difficult verses challenged him in new ways. Eliot's The Wasteland, with its broken narratives and cultural references that Bumpy sometimes didn't fully understand. Pound's cantos, with their mixing of languages and historical periods. These poems were harder to memorize because they lacked the regular rhythm of earlier poetry, but they were intellectually stimulating in ways that made the isolation feel less oppressive. Reading modernist poetry in near darkness, while locked in solitary confinement, created the kind of extreme reading condition that might actually enhance understanding. Eliot wrote about fragmentation and despair and the breakdown of meaning. And here was Bumpy, experiencing those themes as lived reality rather than abstract literary concepts. On day 28, with just 2 days remaining in his sentence, guards noticed that Bumpy had started writing on the walls of his cell, not with pen or pencil. He didn't have those. But he'd figured out that if you scraped the concrete wall with a small piece of metal broken off the sink fixture, you could create faint marks that were just barely visible in the brief moments of light during meals. He was writing lines of poetry he'd memorized. Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley scratched into concrete where they'd remain long after Bumpy was gone. Later, inmates placed in cell 14D would see these faint marks and wonder who'd written them and why. Patterson discovered this during a routine inspection on day 29. Johnson, did you damage prison property? I wrote some poetry on the wall, sir. Didn't seem like damage exactly. More like decoration. The cell was very bare. You can't write on the walls. Understood, sir. Should I try to erase it? Though I'm not sure how I'd do that without the right tools. Patterson looked at the scratched lines, could barely read them in the dim light, saw fragments, wandered lonely as a cloud, and still sad music of humanity. And beauty is truth, truth beauty. Never mind, Patterson said. Just don't do it again. I won't need to, sir. I'm leaving tomorrow. Patterson felt something strange, almost like regret that Bumpy was leaving. The man had turned punishment into education, had found light in darkness, had demonstrated psychological strength that was genuinely impressive. Watching him leave the hole would be watching proof that institutional control had limits. On the morning of day 30, December 3rd, exactly 1 month after entering the hole, guards came to release Bumpy from solitary confinement. Patterson was assigned to the release. He opened the food slot and announced, "Johnson, your 30 days are complete. You're being returned to regular housing. We'll open the door in 5 minutes. Be ready to move." From inside the cell, Bumpy's voice, "I need more time." Patterson wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "What?" "I'm in the middle of a poem. Eliot's 4 quartets. I'd like to finish it before I leave. Just an hour or 2. Then I'll be ready." This was unprecedented. Patterson had supervised dozens of releases from the hole. Every single inmate had been desperate to leave immediately. Nobody had ever asked to stay longer to finish reading. "That's not how this works," Patterson said. "Your punishment is over. You're leaving now. You can take the book with you back to your cell. Finish it there." "I know, sir, but I started this journey in darkness. Would like to finish it the same way. Complete the experience. Just a few more hours." Patterson consulted with the senior guards. The shift supervisor consulted with Miller. And Miller, already unsettled by how the entire 30-day punishment had played out, made a decision that would become part of Alcatraz legend. Let him finish. Give him until this afternoon, then release him whether he's done or not. When Patterson returned and conveyed this decision, Bumpy thanked him and went back to reading in the minimal light leaking under the door. 3 hours later, when guards returned to release him, Bumpy was ready. The cell door opened for the first time in 30 days. Light from the corridor flooded in, harsh fluorescent brightness that made Bumpy squint after a month of near total darkness. But he didn't stumble or shield his eyes or show signs that the isolation had broken him. Just stepped out calmly, carrying his small stack of poetry books, and asked where he should return them to the library. His eyes were slightly bloodshot from a month of reading in inadequate light. His voice was raspy from weeks of minimal speaking. But otherwise, he appeared exactly as he had when he'd entered the hole, except possibly in better mental shape from 30 days of intensive literary education. They walked him back through D Block toward general population. Other inmates watched from their cells. Word had spread that Bumpy Johnson was coming out of the hole after a full 30 days. Everyone wanted to see what the isolation had done to him. What they saw was a 50-year-old man who'd survived the worst punishment Alcatraz could deliver by finding light in darkness, by reading poetry one precious page at a time, by turning isolation into intensive education. The guards were disturbed. They'd used their most severe tool, and it hadn't worked, had maybe even backfired, giving Bumpy exactly what he needed: time and solitude and access to great literature to become even more formidable. Word of what happened spread through Alcatraz within hours. Bumpy Johnson had gone into the hole for 30 days and had emerged stronger, had read nearly 30 books of poetry using scraps of light that weren't meant to be sufficient for reading, had memorized hundreds of lines, had written verses on his cell walls, had refused immediate release because he wanted to finish one more poem. The story got embellished in the telling. Some versions claimed he'd memorized entire volumes word for word. Others said he'd somehow created his own light source through chemical reactions or reflected moonlight. Still others insisted he'd developed the ability to read in complete darkness through some kind of meditation technique. But the core truth was impressive enough without embellishment. Bumpy Johnson had survived 30 days of solitary confinement at Alcatraz by developing a system for reading poetry in near darkness, by finding every possible scrap of light and using it to educate himself, by turning punishment into opportunity. The books he'd read, Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley, Keats, Tennyson, Whitman, Dickinson, Eliot, Pound, and others, became part of his permanent mental library. He'd quote them in conversations for the rest of his life. The intensive month of reading had given him a depth of literary knowledge that most people never acquired even with formal education. More importantly, it had proven something to himself and to the institution, that his mind was strong enough to resist psychological manipulation, that he could find structure and meaning even in circumstances designed to strip both away. That external conditions, even conditions as harsh as solitary confinement in Alcatraz's hole, mattered less than internal discipline and mental resilience. Guards never tried to put him in the hole again. There was no point. They'd used their most severe punishment, and Bumpy had turned it into a private university, had emerged stronger and more educated than when he'd entered. And Bumpy, when asked years later about those 30 days, would sometimes pull out a worn volume of poetry, flip it open to a marked passage, and recite from memory. I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, Wordsworth, lines he'd first read lying on a concrete floor in near total darkness, holding a book in a sliver of light leaking under a steel door, finding beauty and meaning in the worst conditions the federal prison system could create. Then he'd close the book, smile that slight smile that meant he understood something you didn't, and say, "Best reading I ever did. No distractions. Just me and the poetry and whatever light I could find. Would have stayed longer if they'd let me." Whether he was serious or not was never entirely clear, but the fact that he could make that claim, that he'd voluntarily wanted more time in Alcatraz's hole, said everything about who Bumpy Johnson was and what separated him from ordinary men. Maybe all the details of the story were accurate. Maybe some were embellished over years of retelling. Maybe the legend grew larger than the reality. Maybe it mattered.